Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week's topic is neoliberalism, which is a word or a term that a lot of you guys may have heard before. Often it comes along with negative connotations, but I think something that everybody agrees on is that neoliberalism is an ideology that's associated with embracing markets as a tool for prosperity. So I think anyone who's for or against neoliberalism and all the different interpretations that people have, that's something they agree on. It's a kind of a pro-market ideology. So some of us listened to a podcast episode from last year from the Indicator from Planet Money, where they talk about the neoliberal shill of the year award, and they have these brackets, and they're trying to like own the term neoliberal as a positive thing. And I'm going to start by playing a little clip from that, and then we will go around the room and get people's initial thoughts. So here we go. So harness the power of markets to make the world a better place. So that's how they are framing neoliberalism. Or did I actually share that? Yes, I did not share it because I forgot to click the share button. Okay, we will edit that in post. So I will share, and now we will try again.
Project. And what neoliberalism basically said was markets are not like an end. Markets are a means to an end. And we want to harness markets to make everyone wealthier, to make society more equitable, and to make the world a better place.
So harnessing markets to make the world a better place. That sounds pretty good. And that sounds compatible with what we want from basic income, because if you give everyone money, then that allows markets to work better for the benefit of the people. Whoops. Hold on. I accidentally stopped the recording instead of stopping the sharing. This is bad. Here we go. Okay, so if you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to see me fumbling around with technical difficulties. If you listen to the podcast, all of this will disappear. So I want to go around the room and get people's initial thoughts on neoliberalism, what you think about it, and to what extent it feels like something that could go along with basic income in a positive way. So sometimes a criticism of basic income is that it's described as a neoliberal Trojan horse, like people are trying to use basic income to, shrink the government and get the markets to do everything for us and that kind of thing. But maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe the markets could be used better for the benefit of people. So we'll go around the room. We will start with Derek, and then Bethany, and then Neil. Go ahead, Derek.
So I think to preface it, I think a useful preface would be that anyone who's advocated for basic income vocally or publicly has probably had the experience of being assigned a label. Sometimes they might be called neoliberal, but other times they might be called a socialist or a communist or a capitalist, right? And I think that if you find yourself in that position where you're getting contradictory labels, it gets you to think more about, well, what are the definitions of these terms, and then what do people mean when they use them? And so the definitions that I heard in this podcast clip, and that this sort of very, very broad definition of harnessing markets to benefit society, I mean, by that definition, I think a lot of people who don't call themselves neoliberals or people who don't like neoliberalism would even fit under that description, right? So by definition, even in like really stringent regulation of markets, like taxes and restrictions, could be seen as a way of harnessing, right? I mean, that's what a harness is. It takes something that would otherwise kind of roam freely, and then you direct it, you shape it in some way. So the problem there is that, I don't think that actually really gets at what a lot of people use the word neoliberalism to refer to, which is a little more specific, which might be an economic policy paradigm that kind of hit its zenith in the 1980s and a little afterwards, where maybe figures like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher advocated a kind of particular view of markets. And that period of time was associated with a particular policy paradigm. You know, we can get into the details of what that policy paradigm is, but I think for now, it's the important thing to note is that at that time, that policy paradigm did not include basic income, which is, you know, by any measure, a pretty significant change. It's a pretty different policy, right? So that changes it. We might need a new term to describe people who would say, oh, we should harness markets using a basic income, right? Neoliberal might not, that might be confusing to use that term. And then I guess I would also want to add that, like, just for me personally, and the particular basic income policy paradigm that I've like become convinced of and I'm interested in, that is actually in some ways the opposite of the policy paradigm that was used during the zenith, the 1980s. Maybe not, you know, it doesn't mean we're not using markets to better humanity, but the actual policy mechanics are like almost literally inverted, right? So to be, you know, I would say by any reasonable definition, like a basic income centric view of policy probably can't be called a neoliberal, I don't think.
Okay, interesting. Let's go to Bethany, Neil, and then Richard.
Yeah, so I liked the podcast, and that quote that you had from it is really broad. It got me thinking though, kind of like, what was the potential that these academics saw? You know, assuming it wasn't just to like get rich people richer or whatever, for the wealth of everyone. And I think they see the potential of markets to generate a lot of wealth. And as we and many other people have talked about, the problem can then come in the distribution of it. And so I think that's where basic income comes in. So just to give an example of sort of like free trade policies, we've talked a long time ago in this meetup before about how trade is net efficient across the different countries, like free trade. And it helps prosperity across the world rise. But because people are getting their incomes from jobs, and jobs can sometimes be more efficiently done in other countries, there can be all this pushback against something that's otherwise efficient. And so I think this is maybe some of the problems that the sort of neoliberal philosophy may have run into, is that if you pursue the benefits without fixing the distribution of money problem, then you have all these other problems crop up. So like maybe more wealth is generated, but it's mostly going to the top, wealthiest people, or it's not really distributing the way that we would want it to. Which, I'm not an economic historian, but that's my vague sense of kind of like what has been happening since, or what happened with that set of policies. And so I imagine some of the other things are like that too, where maybe they're efficient in theory at least, or were even efficient in terms of generating some wealth and so on, but the money wasn't making it to the people that we wanted to. So I do feel like basic income is maybe like a missing piece in the market potential that neoliberals were seeing. I haven't read their work, but speculating based on the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's if you have a philosophy that has a missing piece, or an ideology that has a missing piece, this kind of speaks to what Derek was talking about as well, do you just throw out that label and come up with a new label that brings in the missing piece, or do you keep your label and say, oh, we figured this thing out that works toward our goals that we already established? Let's go to Neil, and then Richard, and then Eddie.
I realize I basically agree with what I've heard, and I have really nothing additional to add.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Let's go to Richard, Eddie, and then Austin.
Well, what I've seen is that before the whole neoliberalism took off, there actually was an attempt by Nixon to add in a basic income of sorts, a guaranteed income, but afterward it was abandoned. So that's kind of odd in a way, because just a few years after the failed attempt, it was just completely abandoned. So what happened there? Why did something that was considered to be important was suddenly abandoned, and they just went on with something that became really unpopular just 4 years ago, and we have no idea what's going to happen, well, over the next 4 years.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I wonder if part of the answer is that they didn't really understand what they were asking for, what they were trying to achieve, and then they kind of shifted into focusing onto something else without really ever establishing it in the first place. So politically, it got somewhere, but maybe intellectually, it wasn't as far along, or something like that. Let's go to Eddie and then Austin.
So if you look at wealth inequality as a measure of one of the things that you're trying to accomplish with this neoliberalism, and you look back in the past 100 years, you'll find that the markets, neoliberalism kind of worked very well from the Great Depression through the 70s, because wealth inequality went down and down and down. Big trend for 40 years. And then, around the 1970s and 80s, it stopped working, and the trend reversed, and wealth inequality, came back up from the 70s and 80s until now. So I think that neoliberalism is missing what mainstream economics is also missing, which is a basic income that goes directly to the worker consumer and offsets or stabilizes the paradox of the worker consumer, which is also the paradox of productivity growth. So the paradox of the worker consumer is sort of like the paradox of thrift, but it says that you have to, instead of looking at everybody as equal agents in the economy, you have to look at the worker consumer as a separate, as a component, as a separate component. And what happens is that as productivity growth increases production, but at the same time reduces the labor needed to make that production, that also decreases the income to the worker consumer, which creates a paradox, or creates a self-reinforcing loop where the consumer no longer has enough money to actually buy the consumption. There is one of the things that I found while I was coming up with capital consumption theory, is Kondratieff. Kondratieff was a person in the 1900s. He was an economist in early Soviet Russia. And if you looked at price data, going back hundreds of years, and he found these, he thought he found empirically, he found these cycles in the data where the price would go up and down in about 50, 60-year cycles. And the Soviets, they liked this at first because they thought that it kind of meshed well with Marx's idea that there are contradictions in capitalism, and that capitalism would kind of implode eventually and usher in the future area of socialism. Eventually, Kondratieff decided that, looking at the data, that rather than imploding, that cycle is self-renewing, and that it goes down, but it comes back up. So the Soviets didn't like this. He ended up in jail and eventually executed for these ideas. But I think what is very interesting, when we're talking about the term neoliberalism, and a lot of it is thrown around by progressives who are like socialists or Marxists, there is this Marxist idea of the contradiction of capitalism, which I think is very similar to actually what capital consumption theory says. And I think it is the baby that actually should not be thrown out with the bathwater. I think that what happened in the West is that Marxism, with the Cold War, Marxism and socialism all became kind of taboo, and you could no longer be a Marxist economist and kind of be a bona fide in the West. And so our mainstream economists have kind of stopped talking and thinking about capital and labor. And if you actually take a look at capital and labor, that actually explains a lot of what is going on in the economy and what has gone on for the past 100 years.
Okay, yeah, the whole Kondratiev wave thing. I don't know how much I really buy into the idea that you can run a regression on historical data to predict the future. I think that's a little bit tricky, and the idea that you can have these regularly recurring cycles that are predictable in any kind of useful way. Obviously, when we talk about basic income, we're talking about changing all of that and interrupting cycles that are there, but there's always things that are changing. So I don't really not into the whole Cleodynamics, trying to fit patterns to history and extrapolating to the future, that kind of thing. So let's go to Austin. Go ahead, Austin.
Hey, first of all, great topic, especially considering the fact that, don't want to derail the conversation, but my numbers say Biden's about to squeak back in, and one of the big criticisms of him is that he would be a continuation of that neoliberal paradigm, which Eddie, I think, correctly identifies the sort of start, well, as having caused inequality increasing since the 70s or 80s, right? And I think what he said was also pretty much on the money, that part of what neoliberalism is a reaction against what came before that. And what had happened, there'd been almost sort of an inclusion of some left-wing Marxist ideas into mainstream economic thought. In terms of, if Keynes can be seen as at least thinking about the questions of capital and investment and so forth, right? Anyhow, but then that sort of any hint of socialist thinking or something that could sort of rhyme with Marxism had to be banished as a sort of ideological turn occurred. And I think, but just I would identify a few more characteristics about what neoliberalism is. One is that it's very, Bethany touched on this, it's very much oriented around global markets, not national markets. You want to open up to the biggest possible market possible. And at the same time, it hasn't, as a policy platform, done a very good job, I think we can empirically say, of protecting the people who lose out in that transition. So that's obviously a spot where basic income could be really important. I think it's also, when we talk about markets, they also mean not just a market for goods, but a market for shares. So there's a theory called market socialism, where you have a bunch of worker-owned companies that all exchange goods in a market. That's definitely not neoliberalism, right? Because it has to be that the shares of the companies themselves are subject to buying and selling and speculation and so forth. And that's where you see the big drive towards privatization of services, which is, fits with the idea of small government to a certain extent, but it's also about, big corporate, right? I think there's the other, there was one more thing I was thinking about, the sort of defining of neoliberalism. Oh yeah, another one would be a sort of a commitment to balanced budgets, right? So, and I think that is really where the wheels come off, because you're throwing the government, and that ties in with the small government idea as well. So you're throwing open, or you're opening all the windows of the house to the winds of the free market, and then you're also saying, but we don't have enough blankets to go around to get people through it, to sort of, probably a bad analogy, but so at the same time as you're exposing your population to the market discipline of that's another reason that the market idea is the idea that you want the labor market to be disciplined, so you can't have too much welfare, because you need the market to sort of compel labor and make workers efficient and competitive. You're always hearing in Australia about how we have to compete with Asia, which is kind of crazy because they're such different economies. And so I think that this idea of exposing everybody to global trade, and at the same time reducing the role of the government, which might have cushioned that blow, has been a particularly nasty combination, and that we've seen really negative effects on people. You can measure the shortening lifespans in certain communities white men without education, without college educations in the United States and equivalent populations elsewhere, going into a real kind of malaise. The extent to which a basic income would improve that, I think, is up for debate, but it would definitely be worth a try, right? But I think it's that combination of global trade and of globalization and small government, like governments must balance budgets, would be probably the two things that I would say are most defining of the neoliberal turn, and probably or at least the combination that concerns me most, and where I think basic income could help, but it's probably not enough on its own. Although, unless it was a global basic income.
Okay, yeah, so that raises some kinds of questions like, what is the neoliberal approach missing? And we might include basic income in that basket. And then we can say, what is the neoliberal approach doing that maybe is not helpful, and maybe balancing government budgets or pushing for that falls into that basket. So I like that you brought up global markets. Neoliberalism is very much associated with globalization, and the Twitter icon that people add to their handles is this kind of global network. It's the blue global network icon thing, and that means you're associating yourself with the neoliberals on Twitter. So Eddie brought up the question of kind of the post-war period, and he was talking about neoliberalism succeeding during that period. And I guess a question we could ask is, do we really feel like neoliberalism was dominant during the post-war period, or did it really start gaining popularity in the 1970s and 80s after stagflation and stuff like that? And I think most of the people who associate it with, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan would say, late 70s, early 80s is when neoliberalism started to become dominant. But then there's the question of what should the role of government be when it comes to markets, or when it comes to our society. And I think the original neoliberals, as they in terms of how they distinguished themselves from kind of the classical liberals, is that they saw a role for strong government and institutions in setting the parameters for the market, and they didn't advocate basic income as one of the parameters that you set, but certainly basic income would fall into that category. And I think more recently, especially for the people who are more coming at it from a more critical angle, they're using the term neoliberalism to basically refer to total free market fundamentalism, laissez-faire, stuff that you'd more accurately associate with the classical liberals. So I wonder if people are just thinking of neoliberalism as like the new wave of this thing we had before, whereas the original neoliberals were maybe in like the 1930s were maybe thinking about, well, how do you actually engineer the markets, or how do you steer them in the right direction for human prosperity? Go ahead, Neil.
I just wanted to point out that I personally agree that basic income is a good way of going, but there are many other policies which could be used and in the sense of the original, what I understood the original definition of neoliberalism was. You could basically, when we say we're going to have allow childcare, or we're saying we'll have we'll give people money for translating from one job to another. No, I'm not advocating those. I think they have problems. I think which basic income also has, but not as bad. But there's no reason why you have to have a basic income, and in your sphere of what you want to do to fix the market. There's no, to me, it's a very good idea, but there are many other ideas some of which have been tried.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We can ask the question, what kinds of things are broken in the markets? And one of the things that's broken is that we don't have an effective, efficient, straightforward way to get people their money so they can buy stuff. So that's a particular problem that basic income addresses. I don't know if there are better ways of addressing that particular issue, but there are certainly other things that are interfering with markets that that we could improve on, or interfering with the ability of markets to work for the benefit of people. And as Eddie said, consumers need money so they can buy stuff, right? And I think that's you can't get markets doing the best they can for people if people don't have access to money, and it doesn't happen automatically. So go ahead, Eddie.
Yeah, I think that's really a great question, is what exactly is broken. So, I like basic income, for one thing, because it's elegant. It's like, you have all these problems associated with poverty, like people don't have enough money and time for childcare. They don't have enough money for healthcare. They don't have enough money for food and housing. And, you can kind of put them all in one basket and say, look, like Alex says, the problem is people don't have enough money, and we need to get them the money. And then, most of those issues are fixed if they have enough money to purchase what they need. And I think that you can take it one level deeper also and ask the question, if we all believe that the system is broken, the way that we get income to consumers is broken, then, why is it broken? Which part of the system exactly is broken, and in what way that creates this need? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And when it comes to neoliberalism, or the term neoliberalism, as Derek brought up, there's a practical questions of what problem do we want basic income to solve, and what do people who call themselves neoliberals believe about markets, and how can we move that in the right direction? And then there's the kind of semantic questions of, do we want to use how do we want to use the term neoliberal, and do we want to associate with it, own that term? Do we want to distance ourselves from that term and come up with something else? Do we want to talk about market socialism, as Austin brought up? So let's go to the next clip from the podcast, which relates to this question. Here we go.
So neoliberal is this really loaded word. What does it even mean? Neoliberals have been blamed for everything from lowering wages for US factory workers to killing sea turtles. To some, neoliberalism means using markets and the government to make us all richer and happier. To others, it's only made the rich wealthier at the expense of the rest of us.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of like the left view on neoliberalism these days. And people when people on the left use the term neoliberalism, they're imagining all the people who are left behind. If you're talking to someone who maybe identifies as a neoliberal or thinks from that direction, they might say, well, we didn't mean to leave people behind. It wasn't supposed to do that. We still think markets are very powerful, and maybe we want to figure out why those people got left behind and address that problem within a neoliberal framework. Go ahead, Derek.
Well, like he says, it is a loaded term. And I guess in my personal experience, to some extent, we can't help what people load into various terms. But on the other hand, if we have the option, it certainly is more convenient to not adopt to adopt less loaded labels if we're not sacrificing anything to do so. If you can talk about the policy with simple terms that everyone understands and agrees on, then attaching a label like that is really just you'd have to have a darn good reason to do it. So if basic income became politically loaded, might still defend that term because it is the policy that I'm interested in. But if there's an ism attached to that, I don't know. I just don't see an interest. So I guess that is to say, I can certainly imagine self-proclaimed neoliberals advocating for basic income. And to some extent, I don't think that they necessarily acquire a contradiction by doing that. I mean, depending on which ones we're talking about. But then I don't see any advantage to a vanilla basic income advocate adopting the label conceptually, intellectually, or politically.
Yeah, I guess the main advantage would be shock value. oh, hey, now there's all these people going around calling themselves neoliberals and they want basic income and they're owning this term, what audacity, that kind of thing. So it's certainly maybe an attention grabbing tool to adopt a loaded term and to kind of use that to represent yourself. But obviously it comes with kind of all the costs that you were talking about. And it's interesting that you brought up basic income and whether that can become a loaded term as well. Because for a lot of people, it does mean different things. And I kind of go through this spiel at the beginning that basic income means different things to different people. But if you go out there on the internet and look for the definition, some people will say that it has to be a certain amount that meets people's basic needs. And some people will say that you have to pay for it with taxes and that kind of stuff. And then if there's problems with kind of someone's version of basic income, and that becomes the most popular version, and it's not what we're talking about here, then maybe do we just, abandon ship and throw our hands up and adopt a new term for what we're talking about when we talk about basic income, that kind of thing. And I think that can be useful too. That can be useful for both something like neoliberalism or a term like basic income if you're trying to achieve something specific, and then it becomes this broader thing. And the word inequality kind of fits into that category as well. Like people use it in so many ways, and it kind of loses some of its important meaning. Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Well, I mean, yeah, interestingly, I think the basic income movement does have past experience with that and currently goes through it too. And you can sort of think about something like a negative income tax, which is like similar to a basic income, like really similar in the end effects, but then the way you're approaching it is different. So usually I think we adopt these terms to signal a shift, a change in a previous policy position. And so I think maybe the shift from NIT to UBI, that changes that. And I'd even noticed a little bits, hints of that, and how you kind of tend to prefer the term basic income as opposed to universal basic income, even though those are really synonyms. Like, there's a game to play there, but I think what matters really is like the definitions. And so like the point is that whenever we're defining a definition, you kind of have to defend. You have to make that definition and defend it to people. And you just want to pick your battles with that. You want to do it when you need to. Basic income is the only definition we need to worry about and defend, but you don't want to be attaching ones that you'll start fighting windmills. You're going to start fighting these sort of irrelevant beliefs that other people have that aren't relevant to the debate, and that takes energy and time, and it can actually turn people off. It can turn people off of the idea.
Yeah, I think that's right. We have to be aware of the baggage that comes along with various different labels, and if we choose to adopt a label, we want to be smart about it and kind of go in with our eyes open about what that brings on us and what we have to address about the connotations of that label. Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a little bit more in terms of my perception of the ebbs and flows of this idea. Is it seems like people on the left and right were more favorable towards at least neoliberalism as practice, which may or may not sort of map onto the original theorists in the 80s and 90s. Even Clinton and so on, I think was like fairly free trade, and even though he was a Democrat. And now it seems like both parties have moved against. So often the parties are in opposition, but it seems like in this case, like both parties have moved relatively against this set of ideas. Like both parties are talking about strengthening unions, both parties are talking about reducing free trade. Whether or not they actually do it, it's complicated, but certainly the rhetoric has changed in both parties. So I think that's interesting. And, vaguely, I suspect one aspect of that could be that as we've discussed, the policies didn't bring the kind of shared wealth that people were hoping for. And so everybody's kind of turning in a different direction and looking backwards, I think, really to what policies worked in the past to create more shared wealth, which, is not not an irrational thing to do. But that tends to be looking at things like stronger labor unions or other kinds of things like that seem to have brought maybe tariffs and things that seem to have brought more distributed wealth in the past. But I think basic income is an alternative option that maybe allows for more of that sort of wealth generation, sort of the pros of neoliberalism.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought because neoliberalism it's an umbrella that covers a lot of different specific things that people want to do under kind of the general idea that you want to let markets work the best that they can. So I think most of us here would say that tariffs are usually a bad idea. and that, some of us, if we're thinking about basic income as the way people get their money, then maybe there's not so much of a role for labor unions, that kind of thing. I think there are, some people here who are very strongly supportive of labor unions as well. But we can also ask the question of the things that we see neoliberalism doing that are harming people, how many of those things wouldn't be harmful if we had a basic income in place? Bethany, did you want to follow up?
No, sorry, I need to just lower my hand, but I really like the question that you just raised. And I think a lot of the things would not be harmful, would be just beneficial with the basic income chapter, a lot more like free trade and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's right. Maybe there's a few that still wouldn't be great, like Austin brought up, balancing the budgets. But some of the other things, you just, the markets can work efficiently if people do have money to spend. Let's go to Austin.
Hey, okay, so what you just said about the budget, balancing the budgets was what I was going to come back to, and the idea of whether a basic income is neoliberal or not. And I think this is actually basic income could be neoliberal if it's adopted more in the context of, okay, we are going to balance the budget. And what we're going to do is what some right-wing basic income advocates argue is that we're going to take all the social services, including healthcare, including everything that or housing that the government might be providing, and we're going to take all that money that we're spending there and just divide it up amongst the population, rather than have these targeted programs. And that would be, marketizing the government's role in all of these places. And I think that is a neoliberal version of basic income. But the CMT version, the consumer monetary theory, which is, I think all of us in this conversation more or less agree with, this idea that actually, which is, takes the MMT idea that you don't have to balance budgets, and says, and we can use that to fund a generous basic income that allows for the full output of the economy. That is not neoliberal because it questions the balanced budget, sort of fiscal austerity, spending discipline rules, which I think are very key to the neoliberal paradigm, and perhaps the dumbest, wrongest thing about it. And we've seen that's being challenged now because of the coronavirus and the recession, and since 2008 even. Governments have been sort of making exceptions, and maybe those exceptions will become the rule. But I also wanted to say, briefly mention that, so I've been working on an idea for a sort of general political view, which I call global social liberalism, which I've spammed some people in this group with my manuscript. One of the sections I'm going to add to that is called What Neoliberalism Gets Right. Because I think that's, you have to understand what a theory like this, it's not going to be all wrong. And one of the things is what I call superficial diversity. So neoliberalism and globalization also have a cultural component, which is sometimes referred to as multiculturalism. And so the left will attack multiculturalism, on the far left will attack multiculturalism and sort of come around to a sort of almost right-wing position. I'm thinking of Slavoj Žižek here. And they'll say that multiculturalism is the cultural form of neoliberalism, right? But what that means is, okay, so you can have whatever ethnic food you like, and you can, wear whatever fancy ethnic dress you like, but you're all going to be subject to the same economic rules, and those economic rules need to be synchronized from country to country so that we can all do business, and we all know, when you come in, it's sort of my contract law will plug into your contract law. Everything will be sort of synced. You won't be speaking different languages and have wildly different regulations when you're trying to trade between countries, right? And I actually think that that's correct, that what we want is superficial diversity. That when things matter, when things are when I say matter, materially matter, rather than, spiritually or aesthetically or whatever, when it's stuff like, are you going to have enough food to eat? No one wants diversity in that, right? No one wants diversity in are you going to get killed for saying the wrong thing? Like when it comes to substantive issues, there's kind of like with medicine, there's kind of a right answer for a lot of this stuff, and you don't necessarily want to have diversity for diversity's sake when it comes to trade regulations, blah, blah, blah. I would just say that those regulations that neoliberalism has tried to globalize are the wrong ones, and we need ones that are more friendly to the worker or the worker consumer and the ordinary person and the environment and all of that. So one thing neoliberalism gets right, and if there's a turn against neoliberalism, the baby that we don't want to throw out with that bathwater is the idea of synchronizing standards across country or harmonizing standards. The thing is, what we should be doing is harmonizing them up to the higher levels of protection and worker rights and so forth, rather than harmonizing down where the first world tries to, compete with the third world in terms of cheap labor and loose environmental protections.
Yeah, a lot of interesting points there. And we can ask the question if someone who's a neoliberal realizes that a balanced budget and fiscal austerity is not the way to get markets working best for the interest of the people, then is that person going to renounce neoliberalism, or are they just going to say, I guess the question is fiscal austerity really essential to the neoliberal paradigm, or is it that they have a certain conception of how the economy works, of how markets work, and they think that fiscal austerity is necessary for that, or not necessarily fiscal austerity, but at least balancing taxes with spending and that kind of keeping the budget balanced. Yeah, so let's go to the podcast one more time. Here we go.
Liberalism. Not liberal in the way we often talk about left-wing liberals in the US. People go online to own the libs, but classical liberalism. It's just a collective word for all those thinkers who are like moving against the church after the Renaissance. David Hume, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and then you associate those with political beliefs of free trade, free markets, the rights for individuals to pursue their own self-interests.
So most of that sounds pretty good. Letting people do what they want. Free trade, free markets in the sense of at least not impeding the efficiency of markets. But we do want to set the parameters for markets. And I wonder if the neoliberals or some of the self-identified neoliberals are just missing some understanding in terms of how to make that happen. So let's go to Neil. Go ahead, Neil.
Okay, I originally was all for free trade. However, I quickly came to a conclusion that you have to have self-defense, and that was very hard to see what exactly what self-defense meant. You had what industries do you have to make sure you have enough of it in your country? And the present situation, of course, points out one of them. And the other thing I more recently figured out, and I'm not the only one, is that people do not that the labor market is sticky. You cannot, all this beautiful theory that you're going to move the jobs for one which are best for this particular country to this country, and you move the jobs better to another country, doesn't really work, because people get into an employment situation and they want to stay there. So you have a real sticky situation. And in a sense, I'll point out that this is why some people argue that we end up with communities where everybody does something, because it's more efficient to do that. And if you try and put whatever you're talking about, it's more efficient because you have people talking to each other informally, normally, but they're talking to each other, and also they have this similar ideas. Okay, now hopefully this Zoom thing will loosen that up a little bit, but basically, people don't worry about the friction that is inherent in an economy, and so you can change an economy rapidly, very easily. It doesn't. In a wartime you can, or in a Great Depression you can, but in normal economic times, if you can get enough to eat, even if you have very low standard of living, you'll want to stay with your group. This is human nature, and we haven't. And I don't see that going into the mix of people's thinking enough. That's my view, anyways.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the stickiness of labor mobility and the stickiness of mobility in general. We did a whole one of these, by the way, on economic mobility and the impediments to people being able to relocate and that kind of thing. So I'd encourage you to listen to that one if you haven't yet. But I also think it's true that maybe neoliberals underestimate the stickiness and inefficiencies in the market. Like maybe there's an assumption, especially among economists. It's not an assumption in the sense that they believe this is always true, but in their models, they make this assumption and then they add in kind of the complexities later on. But they assume that prices just always adjust, quantities just always adjust immediately. In their modeling, they look at two states of the world. One, the state when demand is at a certain level and the state when demand is at another level, and then they don't always talk about the transition. What happens when you're moving between two states of the world and how complicated that can get. And the reality is, the real world is we're always moving between states, right? You never get to equilibrium, right? There's always changes that you're kind of catching up to and moving toward. Let's go to Derek. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of different points there. I think it's worth. I mean, a lot of this points to the ambiguity in these terms, and I think with reference to some of what Austin was saying about how there's useful parts of neoliberalism to be understood. There's also so much of it that's basic income is such a blind spot for it that it doesn't. I think neoliberals who attach to basic income and try to incorporate it into the model will then sort of be surprised at what that undoes. If you think about CMT is actually, well, okay, if we think about neoliberalism being bad for stepping on labor unions, right? And trying to basically get more out of labor for the benefit of this global economy. Remember that this is in the context in the 1980s of pursuing full employment with government regulation, with central bank monetary policy, right? So from that point of view, I mean, the CMT theory, which is going to maximize output to minimize employment, is in a way radically more anti-labor, you could say, than neoliberalism was. And so these tend to pull in different directions than people are expecting. When you use these terms, people will. I think really that's why I'm trying to use this as a term that describes a particular point in history that people attach to. And like Alex is saying, the economy is always in flux, things are always changing. So we really have to think about moving forward and what policies help us adapt going forward.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's a sense in which basic income is compatible with a lot of different paradigms and a lot of different ideologies. If we're taking the example of neoliberalism, if there's someone who's a neoliberal and then they're thrust into a world that has basic income, they might take a look around and say, hey, yeah, this is more of what I want. Right. This is more like what I'm going for. But if you take someone who's a Marxist and thrust someone into that world, then they might say the same thing. Yeah, this is closer to what I want. So I think, if you fix this thing that's broken in the economy, the people who are frustrated about it being broken and want to fix it, they'll all recognize that this is the solution, and it can kind of maybe bridge the gap even between different ideologies. Let's go back to Derek. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I just remember the one thing I wanted to add and forgot was that it's really funny in a way to notice that the basic income and CMT view are kind of making a dual claim that markets are both more and less efficient than people are typically recognizing. A lot of people argue for when they're arguing for freer markets or deregulated markets, they have in mind an era of growth that was spurred on by policy decisions, right? By centralized policy decisions, and not by total deregulation, right? So then, so that's one thing to point out. But then, from our view, that whole paradigm, that kind of growth, is horribly inefficient in ways that nobody's talking about, that nobody's really observing. Certainly none of these camps were. So again, that just a little note to point out just sort of how deficient some of these conceptualizations are for describing that phenomenon.
Yeah, I think without basic income, markets don't work nearly as well as they could, and as well as we imagine them to be able to work in terms of the potential for markets to work for the benefit of people. Let's go to Bethany.
I probably forgot to take down my hand. Sorry about that.
Okay, let's go to Eddie. Go ahead, Eddie.
So in talking about these terms and talking about the term neoliberalism, I think that there's some real synthesis that can be done if you think deeply enough about basic income and capital and labor. I think that you can synthesize parts of Marxism, neoliberalism, MMT, Austrian economics, quantitative theory, and Keynesianism. Like parts of them, all of them actually fit into the picture. And the differences can be resolved if you think enough about capital, labor, and basic income. So to talk about just Marxism and neoliberalism, one of the aims of socialism or Marxism, classically is the ownership of the means of production. And if you think about what the means of production, what capital is, there kind of are multiple aspects to ownership, and if you thought about the economy in a household sense, you have capital, and capital is something that creates more production. Then you bring it into the money economy, and then you have owners of capital, and then you have customers of those owners of capital who are buying the production, and the owners of the capital get the money, presumably to buy something else. But there's a real equivalency there if you realize that the production, the goods and services, and the monetary and the money, they are equivalent to each other, and the money is also equivalent to ownership, because the ownership is the right to that money coming off of that capital. But on the other hand, the problem with the current system is that the entire system is underutilized, and because the consumers don't have that money to begin with, they don't have enough of it. The capital is sitting there idle with 29% idle capacity in the economy right now, similar to the Great Depression, early Great Depression. And if you just give people money, that is equivalent to ownership. And on the other hand, to realize that if you understand what's wrong with the system, you understand that in a way, Marxism is correct, that if somehow, just kind of ideally, hopefully without violence or whatever, if everybody owned capital, capital consumption theory says that because the capital income is sufficiently distributed, everybody would have, we would not have the problem of underutilized capacity. But we do have that problem because of the concentration, for whatever reason, of that capital ownership to the wealthy, and the wealthy get have so much income that they cannot spend it, and the people who need the income to spend, they don't have it. It's almost like a maze. Like I feel like I'm circling, but there's a point in there. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but the whole thing, it's a picture.
Well, I like your point about the framing, right? So money is a claim on the economy's output. And if everyone has money, as in a basic income system, then everyone in a sense has an ownership claim on the economy's productive capacity. So in that sense, you are using the markets to achieve kind of the communist ideal of shared ownership of the economy's potential. And Philippe von Parijs wrote an article back in the 1980s that we actually talked about in here called A Capitalist Road to Communism, where he talked about basic income as kind of bridging that gap. So you guys should check out that episode if you want to hear more about that. But yeah, basic income gives people control over the means of production in the sense that it gives people access to the means of consumption. It is the means of consumption, and we produce to consume. So that's kind of what it means to own it, right? So let's go to the podcast again.
They believed in the need for unconditional free trade. They believed in the need for the free movement of capital over borders as a way to ensure a kind of interdependence that would itself hopefully guarantee peace in the long run.
Yeah, so peace in the long run. So that's an interesting point. If we're all in a global economy together and we're all trading with each other, then when our trading partners suffer, we suffer too. So it's kind of this way to give everyone kind of skin in the cooperative global game. And I think this is something that neoliberals, even people who call themselves neoliberals today, often talk about. That it's about kind of bringing everyone together in kind of a globalized community. They just might not be getting some of the particulars quite right, or designing them in a way that's optimal for the benefit of everyone. Go ahead, Austin.
Yeah, so look, I just wanted to complement what you and Eddie were saying. You kind of covered half of what I was going to say, but the other half I was going to say is, like, we can actually look at what happens with worker-owned businesses that get tried. Either in the context of a market economy like in Spain, or or in Europe, there's a fair few of them, or the US, right, and Australia, or in the context of like revolutionary quote unquote countries like Venezuela and stuff, and they do have sort of inherent problems that they run into again and again. And so for example, if we make bicycles and there's a company and there's 10 of us and we make 10 bicycles a day, right? And they sell for, and you're bringing in an 11th person and that allows us to make 11 bicycles a day, then none of us 10 people who run the factory are actually any better off. Because one more worker means one more, you increase the workforce 10%, you increase income 10% for the company, but everyone's take-home pay stays the same. So there's not actually this drive to expand. So then if you put them in competition with capitalist companies, where the person who's running is like, well, if I get 11 employees making 11 bicycles a day, my income goes up by 10%, right? They will optimize and they will make all their choices towards expanding, and they'll eat up the whole market. Economies of scale kick in and so forth. So then you have to prevent any capitalist activity from happening, and you quickly spill over into this, oppressive state where the state isn't facilitating stuff, the state is shutting stuff down, right? So I can't hire someone and pay them a wage to expand my business necessarily, right? And so that's where this idea of worker ownership, direct worker ownership, does sort of flounder on the rocks when it's tried. The incentives for a capitalist manager are different from the incentives for a worker manager, and that means that the idea of direct ownership direct worker ownership has hit its limits. And so you get there's a worker ownership movement. There are people who promote co-ops and stuff, and I'll always be talking about well, look, we've got this company, and there's Mondragon, I think it's called, in Spain, which is the biggest one. And it's like, and they make bicycles and washing machines and various things. And it's like, yeah, well, they're not making computer chips, are they? Right. And they're not making rockets. They're nowhere near the cutting edge of manufacturing and production, because a worker-owned, and I mean, this is why some people will kind of like them as well, is a worker-owned business or something like that is less aggressive. It's sort of the DNA of a worker-owned business is not as aggressively expansionist. So you can imagine context in which that's really that's fine. Like some people talk about, you if you have you do attach to what are called anchor institutions. So you might have, say you've got a local council and it needs the garbage picked up, right? And then rather than hiring a private company, you could hire a worker-owned garbage cooperative, because they don't really need to grow. They service one customer and they know what the size of their market is and how big they need to be and so on, right? However, there are hard limits to that. So that's why I think, basic income is an interesting way of sort of squaring that circle and achieving sort of virtual simulated worker ownership of the whole economy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there are other kind of like corporate social responsibility goals that at least some people want businesses to have as part of their objectives. But at the end of the day, it's hard to create a non-competitive business, or it's hard to keep it alive unless you also create an environment that protects it from losing out to competition. So that leads to kind of like all the complexity that you were talking about, Austin. Did you have more you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to, the other thing is that they sell them. So the workers will own a cab company, for example, and they'll say, we've got this, someone will set up this worker-owned business, and then, some capitalists to come along and say, great business you've got here. How about I keep you all on as employees and I buy the business from you and you all get, $50,000 or something, right? So they would prefer money to shares. And so you have people on the left who are like, no, you're not supposed to want the money. So like, actually, we don't want you to own it, because ownership implies the right to sell, right? So it comes back to you end up having to you can't just create worker-owned businesses inside an existing market economy without sort of outlawing and prohibiting a bunch of activities like, being a shareholder or mergers and acquisitions or blah, 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 right? And now maybe there's a moral case that that you need to do that. Maybe there's a moral case that's like, well, slavery plantations were more competitive than non-slavery plantations, so you had to outlaw slavery and you had to just murder all the people who were doing it until it became morally unacceptable. But that's a case you've got to then make. You've got to convince enough people that the exploitation of in capitalism is so bad that you need to use violence on a large scale to prevent it. Like we had to use violence on a large scale to prevent a lot of bad things. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And we could even say that instead of worker-owned businesses, you could have a consumer-owned economy. So that way, the people are the ones who are kind of have the power and have the control and have the ownership. And that's what basic income gets you, at least part of the way, and it does it through market mechanisms. Let's go to Bethany.
So I liked a lot of what Austin said. Some of those points I hadn't thought deeply about before, like the difference between the incentives that collectively individuals owning a company would have versus one owner. So that was cool. So thanks, Austin. I was actually going to speak to the quote that you had from the sort of section from the podcast. So I haven't done like in-depth research about this, but it certainly resonates with me that the more you have aligned interests between different countries, the better for other kinds of, for peace, basically, right? Because there's a bigger disincentive to get into conflict. And it does seem like that is a benefit of free trade in addition to it being more efficient, and a sort of disadvantage of trying to, say, prop up your workers' wages at the expense of other countries or like that kind of thing. And certainly people who have tried to argue that in general, violence and so on has gone down over time. One of the possibilities one of the possible explanations raised is like greater interconnectivity economically. I don't know that that's been like definitively proven or anything, but that's certainly out there as an idea, as a sort of a long-term historical trend also. And you can even imagine this, like, I think they even talk about it from smaller scale to slightly larger scale to even larger scale and so on. Like when tribes are just kind of like raiding each other's cows, versus like they actually have some kind of trade relationship that might disincentivize them from raiding each other's cows, all the way up to like what we think of as modern nation states. So anyway, I thought that was a good point, and a benefit of international trade that's separate from its economic efficiency. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we saw that. And I think this was like one of the main stated goals of bringing together the European countries into the shared economic zone and the shared political zone and the shared monetary zone. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I was going to speak to that too. Although, I'm not quite so sure. I think it's absolutely true. When you align people's incentives, they're much less likely to conflict. But of course, the neoliberal claim really is by opening up free trade, right, between countries internationally, this lowers the incidence of war or conflict. And I remember even some quotes about, like, well, the more McDonald's there are in a place, then the less chances there are those two countries will go to war, something like that. Well, maybe, but and we only have to look at sort of the great wars of this past century to see that very developed, thriving economies that traded with each other and were connected in a lot of ways have erupted into horrible conflict in the past. The fact that money was going across borders and goods were going across borders did not seem to prevent that all being sort of shut down quite suddenly to pursue something else, rather less cooperative. And even today, if you think about the US and China, where there's limitless cornucopia of goods being exchanged and money being exchanged, politically, the narrative that we're telling is very frequently one of sort of competition, and we're worried about the rise of China. This is just everywhere, and so I think a lot of that very similar to earlier stages of history. So I definitely agree that the more that you actually really align people's incentives and real benefit, like the more likely it is that those people will find ways to cooperate. But that's simply the fact that you have a lot of firms and corporations and entities exchanging goods and money. Maybe that's not quite it. Maybe the people who make up all of those firms and countries, maybe they all need to be benefiting together, because it's clearly the case that we've put ourselves in situations where a lot of people in these countries are not benefiting. And there's actually, by going to war, oftentimes there's a rather perverse incentive to actually benefit. People actually benefit more when their countries spend a bunch on war, of course, until one of them loses, then it's a big problem. So that's just something to keep in mind, I think.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. If there are firms trading with each other, certainly there are some disadvantages there if two countries go to war and they're doing a lot of trade with each other. But it's something that we've seen time and time again. But on the other hand, you have multinational corporations. So if you say half of all McDonald's restaurants are in the United States and the other half of all McDonald's restaurants are in China, then McDonald's is going to have a really big problem with the United States going to war with China. So there's some incentives there at the level of the firm where if they've got an international presence, then and that gets cut in half or cut off, then that can be a pretty big deal. And my sense is that our trade, we had in the 20th century, we had these two kind of communist superpowers. We had Soviet Russia and we had China. And we were always more in danger of going to war. And the Cold War was more about Russia than it was about China. And I think a big part of that is, especially in the 1970s, we started trading with China more and more and more, and we remained cut off from the Soviet Union. So China never officially, had a revolution that overthrew communism or anything like that, unlike Russia, but they did gradually start to get more entangled with us economically, and that's kind of what neutralized them as a threat. And then we can worry that if we're imposing all these tariffs on China, if we have a trade war, if you're not allowed to buy, Chinese brand phones in the United States and stuff like that, you can worry that that creates this kind of division that would allow for more conflict. Let's go to one more clip from the podcast.
Countries like the US, UK, they lowered top tax rates, they lowered trade tariffs, they deregulated banks, they weakened labor unions and freed up market forces. This created a lot of winners. It also left a lot of people behind. And there was a backlash. Neoliberalism almost became a political swear word.
So neoliberalism almost became a political swear word. And you have to wonder if basic income had been part of the picture during this, would anyone have gotten left behind? And would neoliberalism have become a political swear word? Would, if neoliberals at the time included basic income as part of their, getting markets to work for people, maybe people, since it wouldn't have hurt people, maybe people wouldn't have bothered so much about, kind of defining it as this kind of market fundamentalist negative thing that leaves people behind, because it wouldn't be leaving people behind. Go ahead, Eddie.
One of the things I learned in the last year or two is that there was a book that was written. I forget the exact title, but it was kind of like the end of war or something like that. And the argument was made that because of the immense amount of trade that is now going on, between nations, nations no longer have an incentive to go to war with each other because that ruins the trade. And the thing is that the book was written in 1910, just prior to the First World War. And if you look at the data, it was actually the prior to the Great Depression, 1920s was actually the peak in global trade, the last peak. And then they started, putting on those tariffs. They started having some of the same problems that we're having now. And it's driven by, again, wealth inequality. And you have suffering populace, suffering workers. And, a lot of politicians find that it works. It's a successful, tactic for them to blame this on other countries. One of Hitler and Mussolini's, big tactics was to demonize other countries and say, oh, England, Great Britain, and other countries, they're all working against us, and this is why we're suffering. And so I think it's kind of interesting. I feel like what happened was that we kind of solved the Great Depression without ever actually realizing what caused it. We kind of just bumbled our way through it, and we got past it. But if we're in a very, a very worrisome situation right now. I'm cautiously optimistic because, the world, economies have developed, substantially in the last 80 years. So everybody's not quite as close to, say, starvation as they were, maybe 80, 100 years ago. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we might not go down the same path again. But it's definitely worrisome, and there are many similarities between the two areas.
Yeah, and I guess so. A question is, how can you get people to be so dependent on each other that they're not going to fight? And of course, we see feuds happen within families, and children not talking to their parents, and all that kind of stuff. So that's probably the kind of the closest relationship that we can imagine, right? And even there, sometimes it doesn't work out. But maybe at a larger scale, if everything's just kind of enmeshed, the more it's enmeshed, the less you have a chance of ripping it apart. Or in order to rip it apart, it takes more of a process, and over time kind of thing. Let's go to Derek.
To a little bit, of an extent, I think that's true, but I also agree with what Eddie pointed out, that sort of looked true in 1910s. And yes, we're more enmeshed now than we were, but at the end of the day, the decision to go to war, is not made by CEOs or companies or the market in general. It is discretionary fiscal policy is what it is. And the fact is that so long as that, whenever we are operating the economy underneath its true economic capacity, there will always be an incentive to use discretionary policy to create unnecessary work for people to do. And the model that I'm using to think of war here is really as that, as unnecessary form of fiscal policy, a particularly unpleasant one. And it is possibly true, I suppose it is possibly true that a certain level of market international connectedness would render it impractical for large nations to go to war, although they might still go to war against smaller ones, which they were not very interconnected with, and maybe some of those will always be around. But that doesn't solve the problem of, so long as you have a serious amount of capacity that's untapped, and you can untap it just by coming up with something to do that's not really necessary. We'd all rather just be prosperous instead of shipping off to fight in trenches somewhere. As long as that's the case, you at least have a risk or danger of that. If not war, something kind of like it, which is a little less unpleasant, but still a horrible waste of time. And I think when we look around, you look at the political rhetoric today, there's an immense a trend to look at in a positive light as the 1940s and the post-World War II policies as what sort of got us out of the Great Depression. That's very common, and so maybe people won't say, well, we should go to war, we should invent an enemy like Nazi Germany and go to war with it to cure our economic woes. But people are still thinking of that as the solution. They're thinking of a large, big project that we all get together in and we do it, and then our troubles are solved. And I would say, maybe, perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps what we call war is maybe inevitable, so long as that's an option.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And to try to tie it into what I was saying before, to the extent that we have the capacity, we have excess capacity, we have capacity to cut off trade with our partners, and we have capacity to go to war with them if we want to activate that capacity for our economy. And I think that's what you're getting at. If basic income, in a basic income world, maybe you're getting the most you can out of the economy, and that includes getting the most you can out of trade. So war starts to look a lot more expensive. Let's go to Richard.
One way to avoid war was political marriage between a king and a princess or something like that of another country. And another way is, there is a country in Africa over the past 50 years that they've never had any sort of civil war or anything like that. It's because they're public employees and whatever take up 80% of the economy, and so they shuffle around their teachers all around the country, and they're intermarry between the tribes. And so they say, what tribe are you? It's a common question, and they say, I'm of this country or whatever, I forget which country. And so that's one way to do it. So a lot of what's happening with the interconnected global economy is that people are going to school in the US or in Europe or something like that, and they find our wife or whatever there, and then they have their children, and they're like, what are you? I'm American and British or something. And so when you have enough people that are intermarried, then it's less likely that they'll go to war.
Yeah, I like that. A question we can ask is, what can we do to get people to feel more like they're all in the same in-group, right? And they're all part of the same community. And basic income certainly, even without getting us to think that people in China are still our people or something like that, it creates an incentive for us not to go to war with China. And maybe once we're all cooperating, thanks to a basic income and other measures not making us need to protect ourselves and fight the outgroup and that kind of thing, then kind of organically we can start thinking of ourselves more as one big in-group. But there's other forces in globalization that help us kind of come together in that way. And I think that's important too. I think all of these factors are real. Let's go to Austin.
Oh, sorry, just driving now. I was first of all about the McDonald's thing. I'm pretty sure the line was no two countries that have McDonald's in them have ever gone to war, and it was true until the US bombed Serbia in the 90s. So it was true for a very discrete moment of time. Pardon me, sorry, there's a beeping that makes the car. Hold on one sec. Better. So it was true for a very specific discrete amount of time, and then stop being true very quickly. I think it's worth noting that war is actually always counterproductive and bad. Like, there's not really ever a good rational case for war. All you can ever say is, well, the other guy is being more irrational, and I have to defend myself because I'm not the crazy person who's starting it, right? But I think there's a natural equilibrium thing there where, it's rational for each actor to pursue a course which ends up being irrational for the whole group. But I'd also add that the conflict is caused, a lot of the time wars are to do with domestic politics, not with domestic politics drives foreign policy. And so what happens, there's a feedback loop where you have increasing global trade that creates dislocation and hurts like specific populations within the country, creates inequality like in the 1930s, like now, right, where some people are left out. And the globalists don't care about me is the feeling, so then the nationalists must. And that's the danger of the current moment, sort of echoing the 1930s, which comes back to what you said with the actual the last clip was, would a basic income have prevented that and stopped people being left behind and prevented that dislocation? I think there's also an interesting point about how, well, if we had an economy that was operating at or close to capacity, diverting spending for war would be harmful to the population. So the population would be, disincentivized to back it. I think that's another case for the basic income. But just on the question of would people feel as left behind, that depends if it was a sort of liberal, a generous basic income that wasn't constrained by the budget, by tax receipts, or whether it was even within that, there's some, wiggle room. So if you had very high taxes on the rich, allowing you to pay a very strong basic income without running a deficit, that might work. But just if you just had some sort of drip feed basic income, the neoliberal basic income that everyone's afraid of, then I don't think that would have the basic income that the left caricature all basic income proposals as, that it's going to be this tiny amount that's not enough to live on, but just sort of keeps you from starvation and keeps you in this sort of minimal maintenance sort of the population. Then I don't think that would have prevented people feeling like they were left behind. There's a degree, there's welfare, like in Australia at least, I'll talk about that. There's pretty decent welfare system. So it's very few people end up in poverty, but only in relative poverty, and they end up in secure housing, but rarely do they die of cold in the street or starve or anything like that, right? So if you have a basic income that just does that keeps people just alive, then I don't think that's that much better than what we've got now. Whereas if you had so neoliberalism would need to ditch either one other thing as well. It would have to come up with agree to a basic income, then either ditch low taxes or ditch the balanced budgets to make that basic income, the livable, comfortable living basic income. Otherwise, you're going to still have populations that are discontent, turning towards some kind of radical politics, which can be radical nationalism, which can lead to irrational conflict and war.
Yeah, I think you're right that if people have just barely enough to survive, then they're not going to feel like they're full participants of society, and they're going to or that they're getting the full benefit of the economy. They might feel like they're being left behind. You said that was relative poverty. I wouldn't say that that's relative poverty. I would say that that's a form of absolute poverty. You're barely kind of scraping by. You've got the bare minimum. That's an absolute thing. It's not relative to how many billions of dollars the richest person has. And I would also add that a small basic income that's not kind of calibrated to the natural level, it leaves open this problem that Derek was talking about. It's not going to close the gap between economic output and the productive capacity of the economy. So you still have this kind of economic cushion that allows you to go to war without making your people any poorer and perhaps making them richer. And I think, it's like you were saying, I think it's true to some extent that war is always irrational, at least from the welfare perspective of everyone involved, right? You're just wasting resources fighting each other. Obviously, in the end, maybe the winners will be better off, and that's an incentive for them. But if your economy is broken, then otherwise irrational thinking or irrational ideas start to become rational in the context of your broken economy. Let's go to the podcast. Actually, Austin, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, just with inequality, right? This is we should do another one just on inequality, although you probably already have. But it depends on, there's different shapes to inequality. So I think a lot of the time when CMT guys like you and Derek talk about inequality, you're talking about the 99 versus 1% inequality, right? So there's lots of different shapes that the graph can take. And what we actually have in Australia is we have a much stronger middle. So we have that spike at the top end, but it's not so high. But then you have an underclass who are less well off than you have a big middle class, and then you have an underclass who exist in precarious work and on the welfare system, who suffer a lot. And some of that is just relative poverty, where it's a matter of you might actually be able to afford a house somewhere or something, but you're pushed to the social margins, and you kind of get stuck in this particular stratum of society. So when this is where, in one sense, if you have a graph where everybody's the same, and then you have, like the God Emperor King or whatever, this one person who's stupidly rich and everybody else is sort of relatively moderately okay, in some ways that's not as cruel an inequality curve as one where, say, everybody's fine except one person who we hold down in the mud, and they have to live off scraps while everybody, there's these different kinds of inequality. And that's why I really think you have to think of inequality in a social context, and why relative poverty matters, which I think reflects on neoliberalism. Neoliberalism doesn't, I think, have as much of a concern about the social fabric. I mean, that's one of the criticisms of it, that it tears up the social fabric, and one of those things is what I would call a gently sloping income curve, so that there aren't these huge, these big class jumps between poor, middle class, rich, which become social in nature, not just economic.
Okay, let's go to the podcast again.
A lot of neoliberal policies have been associated with rising inequality. And in 2016, these people that had been left behind by the global economy, they voted. And we had another tectonic shift.
We are going to bring back the jobs and the wealth that have been stolen from us.
Okay, so there's Donald Trump talking about jobs, and it's not, like all politicians talk about jobs, and that's very much, I think, focusing on job creation is kind of an anti-neoliberal thing as well. Let's go to Bethany, or let's go to Derek. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I have to think about what that last quote, but I did want to briefly just say that I like Austin's point about how you can make a case for that there being this neoliberal basic income where it's a very tiny amount, and then you remove all the government else, and that's sort of the caricature of what the left is afraid of. I think we usually, or at least I usually, like to make the point that, like, well, any basic income is better than zero, but that's exactly why I ended up sort of in the CMT camp eventually, because I didn't have a good answer for why the basic income should ever be lower than it can be. So for me, that addresses that concern. I could get more into the relative poverty stuff, but I want to think more about the clip Alex played.
I think that's right. And when people talk about kind of a neoliberal or right basic income, they're thinking about it as this kind of, and this is actually how Milton Friedman talked about basic income when he was talking about it. He was talking about it in the form of a negative income tax, but it was basically the same thing. He was talking about kind of consolidating all the welfare programs and then reducing the amount until it was gone. So you just simplify and then destroy, that kind of thing. And that is maybe what people would think of as kind of like a neoliberal form of basic income. But if the neoliberals truly want to get markets working for the benefit of the people, they're going to want to maximize the basic income. So I think that is, I think that basic income, in the way that we think about it, in the sense of getting the most out of the markets and the most out of the economy, is very much compatible with at least the ultimate level of neoliberal ideology, that you really want markets to be efficient and effective. Let's go to Bethany. Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, so this comment kind of bridges the last two things from the podcast, but I first wanted to just emphasize what I think you also said, which is that if interconnectedness of trade and so on decreases the chance of going to war, it's just going to decrease the chance. It's not like we can't necessarily look at historical case studies where there nevertheless was war and disagree with that hypothesis. Obviously, it's hard to get like a good data set in history because everything is such an sort of like, there aren't so many samples. This is such a good sample size of different like major wars and so on. But nevertheless, the fact that the world wars, for example, followed more trade doesn't mean that conflict didn't go down overall more than it would have without that interconnected trade. That would be a harder question to answer. And so I wanted to point that out. And I also think that, it's kind of an all else being equal thing. So all else being equal, this sort of interconnected trade aligns incentives against conflict. But as Derek and other people pointed out, maybe there are still other incentives to do it as like a make work program. And also maybe if you do policies, if your trade policies make people poorer or create certain kinds of key types of inequality, as Austin was pointing out, that could be a different kind of incentive to create more conflict with other countries, like to protect the particular industries that are hurt and those jobs and so on. So it might have like secondary effects that work in the opposite direction. I think that's kind of just summing up like some of what people have been saying. And it certainly relates to the quote that we just heard also, this sort of idea that in a way it's a special interest, right? So like specific people who would have had the jobs that have been lost or whatever, but it could be quite a large special interest. And then those people can be very important to the political process, especially in our country where we have sort of an interesting situation where not all votes are counted equally and so on. Certain like special interests based on jobs can have a really big impact. And I'm sure that's true in other countries as well, and for different reasons.
Yeah, I think labor is a really huge special interest in most places, but maybe not so much in a basic income world. So that might help too. Let's go to Neil. Go ahead, Neil.
The point, but I think most wars are for resources. You may want to steal the other person's resource, or the latest war, which is going on now in Azerbaijan. That in that case, Armenia had the people in Karavan had a very good point. In World War I, there was a genocide against Armenia, and there they are in the middle of Azerbaijan, and no land route to get to Armenia, so they went to war to get such a land route. And of course, war is never nice, but so now we're having another war because when they did that, a lot of the people left voluntarily because they didn't want to be under Armenian rule, but some of them were just pushed out, good old ethnic cleansing. So now of course the populace in Azerbaijan is saying, well, we're gonna get our land back. And so, but of course, Armenia thinks of it as an existential threat, because if they lose, they think they're all dead. So so I don't think so. Very often, wars are not due to sensible things. Japan went to a war against us in World War II. Because we blockaded them, and they couldn't get any steel. They couldn't. They were having their economy was in real trouble. So they went to war. So I don't think that looking at war as that. It is often has a rationale to it. Now the rationale may. It may be weak, but either the leader points out rationale of the sort I'm talking about, or there actually is a rationale. So I don't see war as just something irrational. It's normally a fight over resources. Whether you want to be the guy who has all the cattle, because if you don't have all the cattle, you're in trouble, or the other guy's gonna have all the cattle. That's my point, anyways. I'll shut up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point, and you're perfectly right that war always does have some kind of rationale. So it's rational on one level, approximately. There's a reason why you're going to war, that kind of thing. What's maybe irrational is why do we tend to end up in situations where we find ourselves needing to fight over resources, right? And it's not maybe there's rational things that led to that too, but I think a lot of it is unnecessary. And that's where I think basic income can come in, and instead of fighting over resources, we can trade resources with each other, and that's where neoliberalism comes in. Let's go to Derek. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, as long as we're on the war point, I like what Bethany said. It's a very good point that you can't just the fact that something happened in history at a certain time and it was really dramatic, it doesn't say anything about the long-term trend. Although there's debate about whether or not that's even the right way to think about it. Just as a side note, one of the most interesting things I ever read was a debate as an exchange of papers between Steven Pinker and Nassim Taleb on this point. One person trying to say that, look, things are getting better, war is decreasing in incidence over time, and to shooting back and saying, well, actually reducing the incidence rate isn't our goal. Our goal is avoiding horrible catastrophes that are rare and really, really damaging. And it does seem to be that we've reduced the rate of smaller conflicts occurring between smaller groups of people, we also develop technologies that can extend this in really unusual and strange and cruel ways. So maybe they're happening less frequently, but some really, really, really awful stuff happens. And maybe we develop the capacities to erase large portions of us at the same time, that sort of thing. But the point, I think with Alex's point that, yeah, there's something about it that's unnecessary, because if the idea is that this is because of resources or land or something that's perceived that we don't have enough of, but we actually do have enough of it, right? Then if we see that sort of spinning wheel of catastrophe where, however bad it is when it lands, or however often we get the bad slot, that's, well, okay, that's a debate we can have, but then the real question is, well, is it possible for that to just stop spinning? Do we have to spin the wheel at all? Is there a way to actually just get off of that entirely? And even that, I think, is probably most realistically, most helpfully framed from a perspective of reducing the chances of it. But there is always the outside possibility that it's almost entirely unnecessary, and that would be nice. That would be nice if it turned out to be that way. If not, then of course one thing we can use discretionary fiscal policy for is, ways to avoid going to war, right? Ways to to dampen the effects of it if it does happen, that sort of thing. And that's not too different from normal, and we can continue the march of progress narrative.
Okay, great. Let's listen to one more clip from the podcast, and then we will go into final thoughts.
We know that the US voted for President Donald Trump on a nationalistic platform. The UK voted for Brexit. Now we see tariffs being put back up, between China and the US. And in reaction against that, some people have started to call themselves neoliberal again.
It is kind of a bit punk in the sense that to call yourself a neoliberal now is really transgressive, to say this is how we self-identify when all of the political energy that we see is going in the other direction.
Yeah, so this is kind of what I was getting at with the shock value thing before. So let's go around and get people's final thoughts. I'm going to change up the order a bit since Derek just talked. So we'll move Derek to the end, and we'll move Austin to the beginning. So we'll start with Austin, and then we'll go to Bethany, and then we'll go to Neil. Except we won't go to Austin because he's not here anymore. So we'll go to Bethany, and then Neil, and then Richard. Go ahead, Bethany.
So Great discussion. I think that, again, as we said, the really broad definition of neoliberalism in the podcast is maybe not controversial, at least among a lot of Americans. But then the term has become associated with particular implementations or like particular schools of thought in a particular period of history, which is maybe a more narrow view of how to use markets to benefit people. And I guess my final thought is just I do really feel like if you want to use markets to benefit people, you have to deal with this money distribution thing that I brought up at the beginning. So I think I'll just re-emphasize that basic income can really help the pros outweigh the cons of allowing the market to work for what it works for. And I guess one last thing that we talk about many other times, we didn't talk about it as much this time, is of course, maybe part of the key is to think about what should be handled by the market and what shouldn't. So maybe some things are not well handled by the market, even with the basic income, roads, Neil brought up the military, maybe healthcare, these kinds of things. So I think there's also that balance to keep in mind that I would add to my own thinking about this kind of topic.
Okay, great. Let's go to Neil and then Richard and then Eddie.
I have nothing to say.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Let's go to Richard and then Eddie and then Derek.
Well, the whole thing about neoliberalism, as I think of it, is that they're trying to spread like globalism and, well, getting rid of the differences between cultures. Like we're shifting our telemarketing and whatnot to like India and the Philippines and things. And so we're trying to bring to make other countries will have English as a second language and eventually make it their first language. And so, and have similar cultures and eating habits and things, even though maybe those eating habits aren't particularly good for them, like they're becoming massively obese because they're not used to those sorts of things. But as we keep going along, they're like these cultures clash, like the whole well, in the Middle East, a lot of people still think of the Crusades as modern history or whatever for them, and that's part of their reasoning for the whole, like September 11th and whatnot.
Yeah, interesting. Let's go to Eddie and then Derek.
I'm very supportive of resolving the differences between Marxism and neoliberalism through basic income and through making everybody an owner of our economy. And I also want to add to that it's a necessary step, that part of what you get from thinking about that capitalist consumer worker circle is that if you don't put in this basic income, you eventually get to a point which we're getting to now, where we'll begin to see this whole system start to stall out. Very likely that we'll see the whole system start to stall out because without that basic income, that the capital itself is unable to increase and it is unable to realize its value, because a factory that sits empty is half of the time is half as valuable as a factory that's always working. Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Will we see our economy stall out? Or maybe we could ask the question whether our current economy is stalled out compared to where we could be, and we've been stalled out. Go ahead, Derek, final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately how I look at this is from the perspective of, is the neoliberalism term useful? Is this a useful way to advocate for basic income, or for anything else for that matter? And actually, before I was ever sort of waylaid by the idea of a basic income, the problem I was working on or thinking a lot about was, basically what's the difference between an ideology and a theory or a model? Like, is there no difference? Are these just synonyms? And I sort of, my working conclusion on that was that, well, there is sort of a difference. There seems to be something changes when something becomes what people sometimes call a movement, right? There's usually an expectation that there's sort of a group of people associated with a series of ideas, and there's betting on enough people accumulating under this label in order to get something done. And I think the whole advantage of basic income is that you don't really have to do that, right? I mean, if you have a theory and if you have a model of policy, I think that's a different way of approaching these macro issues that can be useful. I mean, a theory is much more flexible than a movement or a group, which can acquire all these connotations, can acquire disagreeing groups of different people. The theory is something that, it's a model, you come up with it, you don't identify with it, you can add evidence to it or take evidence away. You can actually, if later it turns out that you were wrong, you can take the best stuff out of it and create a new theory, a new model, and say, actually, I changed my mind, sorry guys. And that actually happens a lot in science, and usually there's some embarrassment around that in people's personal or careers and that sort of thing. But that's actually part of the process, and that I find very useful and constructive in a way that I don't really find this other stuff. So there certainly is shock value to trying to rescue the neoliberalism with basic income, but I don't attach much value to that shock value.
Yeah, it's hard to change your mind in a political movement because the belief is part of the identity that you create for yourself. And I think you're right, Derek. I think we can view neoliberalism as an ideology that's compatible with basic income, as many ideologies are. But I'm not sure that we'd want to call basic income a neoliberal policy in much the way that we wouldn't call it a Marxist policy, even though it's also compatible with what Marxists want. It's compatible with what a lot of people want. Everybody wants a better world, or most people want a better world for humanity and a better society for humanity. So that's the end of our discussion for today. Next week's topic is subsistence UBI, and we're bringing in two featured guests from the UK, Barb Jacobson and Jeff Crocker, and we're going to be at a special time. We're going to be at 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT next Wednesday. So I hope people can make it out to that one. Thanks, everybody.